Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. This is episode 97 of the Casual Stream. I am once again joined by Florian. Glad to have you here. How you doing, Florian?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, this is a part of our continued investigation of the intersection of science and faith. I brought up to you, Florian, a couple weeks ago the idea of looking at the debate that wasn't, the Huxley Memorial Debate, which only exists in the form of a recording, but is what took place in February the 16th, 1986. And it was at Oxford, and it was a debate on whether the doctrine of creation was more valid than the theory of evolution. The two creationists were one Edgar Williams and A. Wilder Smith, and the two Darwinians were Richard Dawkins and John Maynard Smith. What makes this interesting is that if you go to Oxford, there's allegedly no record that this happened. They lost the transcript, and they won't say. But of course, we have the recording, and we have, it's not the best, but it's pretty good for knowing who's there. So Dawkins was there, and so I thought this would be interesting to look into, because the question is, well, then what was in this debate that caused the Oxford Union or Oxford University to just cover it up? So without any further ado, I think I'll just ask you, Florian, what were your takes on the debate? Let's start with that.
Yeah, very good. I think there were two more people one more on either side. I think
well, there were students. There were students that were.
Oh, students like what's her name? Sith, Danielle Sith.
Yes. A lot of those were students, by the way, too.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And the one who started the debate, Wilson, sounded actually pretty young as well.
Yeah, he was also a student.
Oh, he was also a student. Yeah. I think my general 10,000 foot view was that the evolutionists, first of all, they did win votes from the beginning to the end. I mean, in the end, it was much more equalized towards creationism, and I think also and that's a general tendency with scientists or with evolutionary biologists who dismiss creationism. They basically have this pseudo conciliatory view that they say, evolution is totally. I mean, you people of faith, you can. I mean, he openly says evolution is compatible with a belief in God, right? So basically, he offers his viewpoint to the religious people, but the other way around, they don't allow themselves to say, okay, religion is compatible with evolution. They never go themselves that route, right? They stand there and say, hey, you can come over to our side, that's fine, but they will never go over to the religious side from themselves, right? So that's always like, yeah, we are open, but not quite really. And I think some of the people that spoke on the religious side, actually, I think Wilder Smith brought the argument that I mentioned last time, that he looked at several things that evolution cannot explain from pure scientific point of view, right? The chirality, that all our amino acids that make up our proteins are all the L form, not the D form. So they're always like one chiral form and not the other. That is something that science alone cannot explain. And he also criticized that Miller's experiment, where they had a reducing atmosphere in a test tube basically, and put a lot of energy and electricity into it, and then they kind of simulated the primordial soup, and they were able to generate amino acids, but not nucleic acids. So Miller's experiment is taken as some kind of like a proof that life can emerge from a biological matter, but it hasn't been shown that all parts of life can emerge from that, right? So to not go too much into detail, my overall impression was that the evolution side was a little bit more intolerant than the creationist side, and I found the creationists were a little bit more open towards other argument than the evolutionary scientists were, because they were just standing there. We have the truth here. What you gonna do? We know the truth. So suck it up. That was their point. That was their point of view, and of course, that's not very good to win debates, as the result has shown.
Right. So there's a few things to say here. On the one hand, the final vote was 198 in favor of evolution, and then 115 against or for creation. So on the one hand, yes, that's an absolute win for evolution. But remember, that's the total vote. So that's 1/3 of everybody in the audience. And this is Oxford, Cambridge, Oxford, UK, not the American South, not any area where you have, a lot of built-in fundamentalist or biblical literalist population, right? This is the most unfriendly environment you can have. So on the one hand, it is an absolute headcount defeat. But on the other hand, I think that that's a kind of a implicit win. It's like, well, you're going into the most hostile environment and you still are able to convince about 1/3 of the audience that you're right. I think that's actually a kind of it's a kind of a win, right? It's not an absolute win. And the reason why I say this is Richard Dawkins, who did debate Christians and creationists, was told by Stephen Jay Gould not to, and don't debate the creationists in general. And we can, I don't want to go to the whole Gallup thing and all that, but I do wonder if this is partly why, right? This is not the best showing. This is probably the most unfavorable place for a creationist to go. Now, if we look at the four main speakers, right? There's Edgar Andrews, and then there was Dawkins, and then there was Wilder Smith, and then there was John Maynard Smith. And then there were also the students. A couple of the students, the female students, were giving maiden speeches, so it was actually the first public speech. I think with the exception of Peter Ross, and I'll get to him in a moment, most of the students, I think, were just kind of padding and weren't very helpful. So Edgar Andrews argues that there's four things science can never explain: time before the creation of the universe, science itself, genetic code, and mind. Now, Dawkins and Smith never deal with that, which is okay. That's just how the debate unfolded. The genetic code angle is picked up again by Wilder Smith, so I won't say much more on that. I would agree with Edgar Andrews' point of view on all four of those, and I've talked about them before on the channel. Now, Dawkins here is very interesting. The first thing he does is he makes a false equivalency between the Roman Empire and what we might call Earth history, because he's just incredulous. Why do I have to defend this? And it's like, well, the difference between Rome and the Roman Empire and what we might call Earth history is that the Roman Empire has people that could see what was happening and wrote down accounts. Whereas with Earth history, that's not the case. So I would just argue it's a false equivalency. It's totally different. Like there's nobody that was sitting down and, watching, the first fish come onto land as an amphibian and then wrote it down and, I observed this, right? We don't have that. Whereas when say Caesar is killed in the Senate, we have people who saw it, right? So that's just a false equivalency that Dawkins didn't get called out on. Now, the other thing is, in Dawkins's presentation, he's interrupted by Peter Ross, who then on his own and brings this up later. He says that the two boxes, dispatch boxes, are alike, and he's like, okay, does that mean they evolved from a common ancestor? And of course, the implication is no, they were built to be fungible, right? I mean, that's the entire point of modern day production, is to have fungible objects, which means they look similar. Now, Dawkins is just completely nonplussed by this, which is really kind of weird, because the argument for common descent, which comes up in this debate, and I mean, it's sort of at the heart of it, but people don't, again, Smith deals with it more directly, is the idea that because there's all these common features, that's a sign of common descent. And the joke is meant to be, well, what about the other one, design? And it's common design. Are we supposed to believe all the dispatch boxes evolved from a common dispatch box? And that's why I thought it was he actually added something from the guest student speakers, added something useful, because there's this assumption that homology is just self-evident, or sorry, common descent is the self-evident inference from homology, but it's not. And then you have Dawkins. Now, this is really interesting. Dawkins says in 1986 that it's perfectly reasonable to be a person of faith and believe in evolution, theistic evolution. But Florian, you and I, when we listened to his debate with Lennox, said that all the NOMA crowd, the science literacy crowd, was mad at Dawkins because Dawkins was attacking theistic evolutionists as pseudo-fundamentalists and the real enemy. And this actually brings up an interesting question. In about 20 years, Dawkins completely pivots on theistic evolution, says it's completely dishonest and fake. We need to just drive it out. And then 20 years after that, 2025, he's a cultural Christian. So he basically changes his mind every 20 years. Is Dawkins like even a serious? Is he just an actor? I'll ask you that, Florian. Is he just an actor?
He has a evolving mindset, which is not really. It's a 20-year Dawkins cycle. Like the cicadas come up from the earth every 23 years, something like that. No, I think Dawkins is just trying to hang on. I think he's trying to ride a wave of public perception. He's not really bringing something original to the fold. He's just trying to pounce on an opportunity when he sees one. Right? He basically changes his how do you say? He changes his flag no matter in the direction that the wind blows.
Yeah.
So that's my impression with Dawkins. He doesn't strike me as a general very courageous person. Let's say it like that. But then what I find then what I really don't like about Dawkins is he in his point. I think the point that he made in his part of the debate was he also urged people that to oppose the motion. Of the motion was that the doctrine of creation is more more valuable or more true than
more valid. I'll restate
more valid.
The doctrine of creation is more valid than the theory of evolution.
Okay, so he urges people in Oxford to oppose this hypothesis to prevent Oxford's reputation from being associated with fundamentalism. It was a very odd framing, and basically that fundamentalism that hasn't really existed. I don't remember back then in 1986. I don't remember whether he said that very word, but that's kind of seemed to be the gist of what he was saying. And this is again some kind of moral absolutism, like he's right and the rest isn't. And it's not fundamentalism for him because he's a scientist, right? He's all scientific, so it's the truth, right? He's not a fundamentalist. But of course, his arguments are that of one, and I don't like this about him. And I mean, maybe that's also why Dawkins hasn't made himself very popular. Hasn't yet reached the hearts and minds of many of his opponents.
Yeah. Now let me just get to the other two debaters. So we have Wilder Smith. Now you mentioned some of his genetic arguments.
Yeah.
The points that I remember, because again, some of that went over my head because he is very specific into the biology. He said that abiogenesis only happened once. It wasn't observable. Therefore, whatever it is, it can only be considered a scientific explanation. It's non-repeatable and non-observable. He also said that that's where he gets into the homology. He says speciation doesn't demonstrate the fact that we came from a single organism. He admitted that within species they could speciate, like the moths and the finches, but that mechanism could explain everything from amoebas to man. He said it couldn't. And then he also brought up the genetic code as information, which Edgar Andrews touched on. That was his argument. And then Smith, again, he grandstands. He just says, well, first thing, he says that the scientific whereas Dawkins was making fun of Edgar Andrews, saying his scientific or mathematical calculations were false. Smith says that Wilder Smith was correct, that the scientific information he presented was correct. And then he just sort of, dances around that and nitpicks things. Now, the interesting thing here is that if we look at a debate and we gauge who wins and who loses, not based on a head count, but based on performance, if one side in a debate resorts to formal or informal fallacies and the other side doesn't, all things being equal, the side that doesn't wins. And what's interesting is that both Dawkins and Smith engaged in informal fallacies. So, for example, Dawkins says that Edgar Andrews engages in special pleading, and then he ends with the reputation of Oxford. Edgar Andrews interrupts and says, didn't you just accuse me of special pleading? And then Dawkins actually admits that, okay, he drops the point. That's interesting. That's a score in Edgar Andrews' favor. And then the other point is Wilder Smith says that creationists only look at what evolution can't explain, and therefore, sift through documents and texts and try to find and nitpick it to death. And Edgar Andrews says, well, isn't that what you and Dawkins have been doing to me? And then John Maynard Smith says, oh, but we had to because you were being dishonest. Special pleading again. So really all Dawkins and Smith can do is engage in special pleading, which is, would cause you to lose a debate by the terms of the rational discourse that debate establishes. The other thing that's interesting is that, again, the homology doesn't really get dealt with. The idea that, okay, no, actually, that's the point. Smith says that you're right. You could assume that homology is the result of intelligence, just like with the dispatch boxes. But then it explains everything, which means it explains nothing. But what's funny is Dawkins ends his speech by saying evolution is this grand, big, expansive explanation of everything, and that creationism is too small and explains nothing. So which is it? I mean, you can't say, well, one side says that, oh, well, that explains everything, so it explains nothing. But then, Dawkins says evolution explains everything. So by Smith's own judgment, that would also explain nothing. And so I think the whole debate hinges on this one principle of extrapolation of homology, design or common descent. And that's, again, why I think that the one student speaker, Peter Ross, is actually really good, because he brought that up. And Dawkins can't even answer it, which to me is kind of embarrassing. I mean, obviously he's heard of the idea of homology being explained by design. And Wilder Smith just kind of punts. And it's like, well, that's not very serious. So I guess what I'd ask you, Florian, is what do you think of the argument proposed by Edgar Andrews, Peter Ross, and John Maynard and Wilder Smith about homology being best explained by design rather than common descent?
Yeah, I think, first of all, when Dawkins says that evolution explains everything, that's him mistaken like many scientific breakthroughs that have been made that then turn out that there's a simple explanation. Doesn't mean that now there's like one overarching explanation for everything as well, right? That's just an assumption, and it may not be. If you do like the Occam's razor and apply that, you may still go into the wrong direction, right? And find very simple solution into the wrong direction. What I personally don't quite understand, I think there's no real difference between microevolution and macroevolution. And I don't think it makes anything, I honestly don't think it makes the creationist argument invalid. Like, you allow for microevolution, but macroevolution is just a series of microevolution, right? How do you climb a tree? How do you climb a mountain, right? It's unsurmountable, it looks like, and then you just like one small step after the other. If you look at the humanoid precursors, like the Australopithecus and all these, how do you call it? Like the in the the missing link between ape and human, basically. Basically, it's a very it's a very it's a very subtle development from an ape, from a pure primate, or from a primate that looks more like an ape to a primate that looks more like a human. So and that would basically, you end up as human as a species, even though it started out as a primate or even an ape as a species. So I don't think macroevolution is impossible. If you're able to explain microevolution with genetics, then you're also able to explain macroevolution. But I think homology can mean both. There's a common. I mean, there can be a common precursor, and that was created by something else than out of abiotic mass, right? So if you do the Miller-Urey experiment again, and you find that there is amino acids being formed but nothing else, yeah, maybe you need something more than just energy and abiotic mass to create life. But once that life is created by whatever means, it can go through a process of evolution and bring forth humans or other complex life forms just as well.
So, one other point I wanted to make, I forgot about this. I wrote this down. This really just shows you like the level like galaxy brain delusion that scientists work with. So John Maynard Smith says to the audience, because they're going to have the vote at the end, don't think that because Wilder Smith leveled these criticisms of the Urey-Miller experiment that we can't, and then say, well, we can't produce life in these conditions of the primordial soup. He's like, we're going to do it soon. He literally says that. And now 40 years out, we're no closer than Urey-Miller was. I mean, these people live in an absolute delusion bubble that was 40 years ago. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think soon is 40 years. I think that's like a couple years. But then the other thing is, so let's part of it is this debate didn't really allow for the complete unpacking of this. So let's go back to what I believe to be one of the centerpieces of this debate: common descent versus design to explain homology. Now, Wilder Smith mentions the time dimension, which is very important here. So let's look at, I'll just pick a wolf, right? It's an animal we all know. Now, with the level of species, so with speciation, they mentioned the peppered moths and they mentioned the finches. But what we don't see, right? Because the argument is, well, the microevolution is just on a long enough time frame will get you to macroevolution. Well, here's the thing, though. One is observable, right? We've observed the peppered moths, we've observed the finch beaks. But let's look at the level of family, Canidae to Felidae. We've never observed that change, and we've certainly never observed a change at the level of domain to kingdom or phylum to class. So the question is, of all the purported changes that would have to occur, man is only observed at the level of species and maybe genus, but certainly not family and up. And the question is, if we're going to argue this is a scientific theory, then there's two ways you can have science, right? You can have observation, so like nature, natural causes, you observe nature. That's obviously not test control. You're just observing the world around you. And then there's test controls in a laboratory. Now, in either of those cases, we've never seen changes at the level of family up. And then the argument would be, well, why would we assume that?
Well, there's some, for example, you could look at the green algae called Volvox, and this algae is part of a family. It's basically part of, I think it's several different species, and they differ in the number of cells one aggregate has. Like Volvox has one form that is aggregated as a sphere with another smaller sphere inside, multicellular. But then the same family, there's also a single-celled algae, right? And researchers have looked into the differences across this family, and they found that the amount of adhesive molecules increases. Like if you get multicellular organism out of that one cellular organism, they are able to stick to one another much better, right? And then it makes sense, right? Then you get more clumpy aggregates later on, and so, but that's still not really a different species. You're right. There's just like you observe differences within a species, but you're never able to create a new species out of that. And the argument would be that I mean the time scales are just too long to observe anything. But I'm kind of like doubtful whether that is not a cop out, because you should have, I mean, if it's so readily possible, you should be able to observe these changes. It's more likely that maybe many changes have to occur as once, and it's very difficult to have many changes at once. Then again, it's difficult to explain.
So, but the other thing too, Florian, is to sort of, because again, with this debate, there's a lot of background knowledge that many listeners won't have, at least from the creationist argument, because that's just not something people are familiar with, right? So,
Right.
but again, like I said, this debate did hinge on homology is it best explained by design or common descent. So one objection was the time scale, and you're not able to observe it. That's what Wilder Smith points to with like abiogenesis. It's not observable, and it's not repeatable. Like you can't repeat it in a laboratory. And furthermore, even if you could, that actually just proves the fine-tuning argument, because it was a scientist who had a will and an agency who fine-tuned the experiment to create it. So even if they could create the primordial soup and give birth to life, that would just prove intelligent design. It would prove that you had to have, the fine-tuning of this entire experiment by a human being, right? So even if you could do that, it wouldn't actually prove the narrow Darwinian account. It would minimally prove the idea count.
It's very difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult to it's very difficult to create a testable hypothesis where you switch off the random genetic mutation, and then you would still need to explain how speciation comes about. It's just very difficult to explain in the laboratory. So what you're relegated to do in laboratory settings is basically analogous settings, and then basically derive your wisdom from them. Like this Miller-Urey experiment is an example, right? You just create a similar atmosphere. There's no way that you can create the exact same atmosphere that was there in like a million years ago on Earth. So that's why it's difficult to prove anything in the lab, basically.
Right. Now the other component to this objection is that the principles of natural information, and that's something that was not fully explained, but was a centerpiece of both creationist arguments. And the idea goes like this: so the DNA molecule strand has 4 letters, right, that it uses, and that's a language which can then be used to program and code the entire biological system. Now, the argument goes like this, right? There are no natural processes that add information into a system. A natural process. So, for example, they didn't mention him, but there's a guy named Shannon who comes up with information theory. And the idea is you have a sender, a transmission, and a receiver. Now, information can only be preserved or lost absent some new injection of information. So that's why you have to have usually multiple levels of redundancy when you send a message for someone to receive. And then furthermore, the sender is a person, right? They have to have specified complexity, which is that information that they're sending out. Now, there's information in the genetic code, and the argument then goes, if you have natural processes which at best preserve and at worst degrade the information in the DNA, where did it first come from? And then you also could somebody brought up the first speaker brought up an explosion of ink at the library. So if you were to describe a newspaper and say, well, look, you read, front page, the big news of the day, and then you try to explain that information by by describing the chemistry of the ink in the paper. You don't describe the meaning of the words on the page. By that level of accounting of the paper and ink in a materially scientifically correct sense does not explain the information in the paper and the ink. And so they would say, well, look, there has to be design involved. There has to be some agent, some will involved in giving the information to the DNA. Now, Francis Crick also sort of agrees with this, but he just believed it was aliens. It was called panspermia. And one of the things that the new atheists didn't really like about the movie Expelled with Ben Stein is Dawkins admitted, yeah, maybe it's panspermia. And then he asks Dawkins, well, how is that not intelligent design? And it is. Yeah. It is. Now, the difference is it an alien or God? Now, if it's an alien, he only kicks the can down the road because how did that life form develop, its specified complexity in the DNA code? And so that's the other argument. There's the DNA code that natural selection is working on isn't explained by any natural process.
Right. Yeah. And also the good example with the library and the newspaper. Uh, we just like evolutionary scientists would just imagine that there's randomness and sort of like a plan emerges, but they don't quite know what the plan is, right? They just look at patterns and think that's some sort of how it works out, but it's not. It doesn't need to be the plan, right? It's basically somebody who never read a newspaper looks at the letters on the newspaper and thinks it's some strange code or it's some pattern that they use for decorative purposes, right? Maybe somebody in a million years finds a preserved room, and the people just started to paint the walls, and so they have old newspapers everywhere, and then as the researchers conclude, yeah, see, those people use those strange papers with letters on it as a decorative purpose, right? So so it's very difficult to really ascertain what it all means, and that's a problem. That's a problem that evolutionary scientists have. To the question whether order cannot emerge from whether information cannot emerge internally, I think that was the point, right? That you always
Right.
need some
Yeah.
external.
Yeah.
Well, the that goes back to the order argument. Um, there can be mutations that make a protein better at certain things, right? There are mutations that make a protein not just weaker but also stronger and faster. That can also happen, right? And then one would imagine that the organism with that kind of mutation has an advantage because it can build muscle faster and then can run faster or something like that. But so and that would be something where you would say, okay, there's some positive effect, maybe some information emerging from non-information. It could be that you have random processes that are then stabilized at a certain level and then enhanced later on, right? Because now these animals can run faster, and then the offspring can run faster, and they can compete better for resources and so on and so forth. The whole natural selection. But once again, you basically like from a different side, from different parts of the ecosystem, that mutation may be bad for them, right? Maybe a negative mutation for them, right? So it's always a question from where you look at the whole system. Um,
So, oh, is that it? Because I was going to add another layer of.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
please add
Okay, I
your
was going
layer.
to add another layer that would help here. Okay. So going back to the. So just to recap, okay, we said that the argument that was sort of implied or at least stated without fully unpacking by the two creationists was one that the time dimension you can't observe any of this. So whatever you want to call this explanation, it's not a scientific explanation since observation is not a part of what we're talking about. The second one was the information, right? The idea that there's genetic information in the genetic code that cannot come from a natural process, right? You can't appeal to chemistry or physics as and underlying processes, because of course biology sits on top of chemistry and physics, and none of those laws give rise to information in the interacting with them. So we have to have a designer. And the third point, which again it's implied. So if you're not familiar with the literature, it's a little tricky. The third point is even if we allow for speciation and environmental factors to select for or against certain traits, the problem then becomes how do you select for something that isn't there? So for example, you could select, you could delete information like cave fish losing their eyes, right? That was a mutation that because if your eyes consume energy and you don't need them and you're in a cave situation like that, it's more efficient and adaptive to lose those eyes because it's just wasted energy, right? But if you put those fish back out into the open air and open streams and rivers, they won't get their eyes back. It's not going to go the other way. They're not going to get their eyes back. But then second of all, let's look at the proposed transition from fish to amphibians, right? Well, lungfish have lungs, amphibians have lungs, but there's a whole gene sequence that needs to be selected for. But if you're a fish without lungs, how is that selected for if it's not already there?
Well, one explanation for that could be that you have, I mean, point mutations are not the only source of mutations that are there, right? So basically, we have a lot of viral DNA in us, for example. So basically, in many cases, whole parts of proteins get exchanged and get transported through viruses, for example. So viruses could be one evolutionary motor. They didn't discuss it back then because I think they didn't discuss it in science in general yet. But basically, a virus has certain genes on board, and not all viruses are harmful, right? So viruses attack us or get into our system, and then they integrate their DNA into our DNA. And most of the time, we don't realize anything of that, right? But that's a way to transmit larger molecule, larger, even whole fragments of proteins from one species to another. That would be an explanation. And the cavefish that you take out of the cave, and they will not grow back eyes, but they may grow back other ways of sensing the light, right? So basically, but only if that would give them an evolutionary advantage. It's a little more difficult to use this to argue why so complexly developed organisms like humans can emerge evolutionarily from lower organisms, even on a long enough time scale, right? Because you have to have more than just a few changes to make an eye.
Well, let me put it this way: if you have let's use a non-biological system, let's use a book, or maybe a line of computer code. If you keep copying it and don't have any other human interference, right? Maybe you run an algorithm just keeps copying the code. According to, again, information theory, one of two things will happen: the code will be preserved, or the code will be degraded, the information in the code rather, but you won't get new information because you don't have a sender. And so to even have the new information for the biological organism to have the environment select, they would have to have a sender. And there isn't a sender. So how does the fish get the lung gene to be selected for? Because there's no information being set in. And then furthermore, the other argument would be that it's copying, right? And it's a copying. You might get like a mutation. You might get like 6 fingers instead of just 5, right? But it's copying what's already there. It's not giving you something new. Even if you get an addition, right? And an eye loss is a subtraction, but even if it's an addition, so you have like 6 fingers and 6 toes, or 2 heads, like certain mutants, right? You're not getting something new. You're getting a copy. Right? See the argument there? It's like you're just copying it. Even if you get more of it, it's not like you got something different. You just got more of the same.
Right. The argument would be that gills and lungs are very similar, and they're just better adapted. One point is better adapted to the water, and the other is better adapted to the air. And then you only need a very few changes to transform gills into lungs and backs. Lungs are not really, and even if an organism doesn't have lungs anymore, those lung genes are sort of like still hidden inside the DNA, just aren't switched on. And you could also make the argument that you don't need so many changes, because a few changes during early embryonic development will compound later on, right? So what looks like a big difference later on may only have been a very small difference early. But the point remains that if you look at any organs that highly complex organisms have, or that humans have, at one point you use them as some form of blueprint, and at one point, how can you make the blueprint if you don't have a blueprint for the blueprint, right?
Yeah. So there's another point that you got close to, and I want to double back on, because this will help you explain the position better. Now, this argument was made after the debate. So this debate was 1986. But Michael Behe, he's actually intelligent design. He wouldn't call himself a creationist, I don't think. Not like, say, these two men. Though the Darwinists would, so I guess it doesn't really matter. There's a concept called irreducible complexity, where, according to Behe, biological systems that, according to him, cannot be explained by evolution because their component parts are so interdependent that removing any one part renders the system non-functional. So he's coming at this from an engineering perspective, saying, well, if you remove even one part, one genome, the entire mechanism is non-functional. So then if it's non-functional, until you develop the new trait, there is no biological adaptivity. But so then you wouldn't actually go that far in the first place because it's a non-functioning system until you have all the parts right. But if it develops gradually and you don't have all the parts at once, like gills to lungs, then you have some sort of intermediate thing that isn't a gill, it isn't a lung, and therefore it wouldn't be adaptive.
Right. Once again, an evolutionary biologist would make the argument that there are mutations that are called hypomorph, meaning that if you take one gene away, there's still a second gene that can account for the lack of the first one, right? That's called redundant genes, and that's something that is especially in species like some fish that have quadrupled their DNA. So basically, you have 4 copies of many genes. They can basically be very difficult to study because you can't knock out one gene because you still have a lot of other copies that compensate for that. If you look at the connection of a cell, a so-called focal adhesion that a cell makes to the ground, right? Maybe your muscle make a connection to the tendons to keep it on the bone, right? So on the molecular level, those connections are like 200 to 250 different proteins in there. So there are some proteins that are more important, some genes that are more important, and other genes that we can just let go, right? So basically it's more like it's not like one perfectly functional mechanism. The focal adhesion or any other molecular pathway is not one very specific thing where when you take one protein away, the whole thing falls apart. No, you take the specific things away that are really important to drive this, the whole thing falls apart. But there's plenty of proteins you can take apart, so nothing happens. There's some buffer in evolution, but still, coming back to the homology argument, I don't see how that would deny the existence of a creator spirit. Maybe it just expresses itself in a different way. Maybe the whole, I think, but that maybe just my personal point. I think the blind watchmaker argument, I'm not too convinced by that because nature is so complex that small derivations are basically tolerable. So maybe it's more like an over-engineered German watch that has many different parts, some of which you don't even need. And you take an American to compare American tank to German Tiger tank. The Tiger tanks were perfectly engineered, but they broke down every second. And the American tanks, they were much more easily to handle, right? They weren't as capable as the German tanks, but they were more robust, right? I think that's the word I'm looking for. There's robustness in species, right? If you have a mutation, then the species still doesn't fall apart. But that brings you to another question. Then to go from one species to another will take an even longer time, right? Because you now have to go through mutating 200 different proteins in one mechanism, right? So if only like 10 of those genes are really crucial for a biological process to work, then mutating that process is almost impossible, right?
Well,
So that's what I would say. That would make it more difficult to explain life from purely evolutionary standpoint.
The other thing that I'd want to add, the idea that you mentioned of over-engineered cells that could have some gene sequences break down and still operate. The problem I see with that is it's operating from an already existing system, right?
Yeah.
And so the system has redundancies built into it. But if we're moving from, say, one system, gills, to the other system, lungs, that redundancy doesn't exist yet because we're not dealing with an already built system. And so Behe's argument is the idea that any intermediate state between gills and lungs is going to be a non-functioning system, which means it wouldn't be biologically adaptive. So there's no way that you would have the selection pressure to go from gills to lungs if it took this gradual process, because you don't gain value until it's a complete system.
Yeah, that's basically
Yeah.
that's very similar to what I mentioned, right? It's very difficult to such a robust system to to change into something else, and if it does, like anything that goes in between will be will have to hit some of the really significant part of this whole clump of processes and proteins, and then you kind of like all these versions will all die, right? Um, it's 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 conceivable if you look at flies or other insects or even small vertebrate fish that have huge huge progeny sizes or fry sizes, I will call it. Basically, one zebrafish lays 200 eggs in 10 minutes once a week, and so many of those don't survive. But there's also, if there's one random mutation, yeah, then there's more. They develop also much faster than anything else. Like in 3 months, they are sexually mature again, and the next generation. So if that happens, there's like a species with a lot of offspring and a very short generation time. Then yeah, then you have an easier way of mutating those and maybe evolving those species. But if you come to more developed species, even primates or even chimpanzees, they are very complex already. And if you then it's really difficult to see how they could basically make it into the human way in just like very little time, right? You could say, okay, they didn't need to change as much, but now every change also counts. So then B's argument is a little bit more valid here, right?
Right.
So yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's a
So,
good
but
point to think of.
did these three talking points clarify what Edgar's and Wilder Smith were talking about?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, because again, if you're not familiar with that literature and you just hear this debate cold, you're not going to necessarily understand what they're getting at. And so I thought that it would be helpful to take that. It's not really a detour. I'm unpacking what they were saying in a way that makes it more accessible and understandable. But going back to the debate itself, I guess for whatever reason they wanted students speaking. I thought that was not really a great take. That kind of just padded it out for no reason, but that's what they did. So whatever. Like
yeah.
I
This
said,
this like joke. They said they cracked some jokes in the end or something. I didn't I
yeah,
didn't
yeah. I
listen
mean,
to the very end.
the only student that actually proposed anything I think interesting was Peter Ross,
Yeah,
because he was leaning into homology, which I thought was good. But the other thing is though, I I think the framing of the proposition was weird because the word valid here in this context, I'm not sure what work it's doing. So in logic, you say an argument's valid if it follows in the agreed upon formal structure of logical reasoning. So for example, a hypothetical syllogism, A then B, B then C, A then C is
hmm
considered valid.
yeah,
That doesn't mean it's true, because for it to be true, the conclusion to be true, you have to have it has to be sound, which means all the premises are true premises. Therefore, the conclusion is guaranteed to be a true conclusion. Now, so in that regard, valid was a poor choice of words. It was a poor word choice for the proposition, because both of these are quote unquote scientific theories or scientific propositions. In which case, we're not dealing with validity or deductive logic. We're dealing with empiricism, observation, and experimentation. And so that might have been part of the confusion. I don't think it was a very well chosen proposition. It wasn't framed correctly, is what I'm saying. But the other thing is, ultimately, like I said, Dawkins and Smith resort to special pleading. And I feel like that's just and straw manning, sifting through people's books and then picking them apart and then complaining that creationists do the same thing. Because we need to remember, when anybody criticizes an existing scientific model, they don't attack what it explains. Why would you? That's not the point. Nobody who proposes a new scientific understanding attacks what the other theory can explain. Why would you? There's no need to change the model then. And so when John Maynard Smith objects on those grounds, that's just bad faith, because that's what Darwin did. when Darwin proposed his theories, he didn't attack what the paradigm could already explain. He attacked what he thought it couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think, yeah, I agree. I mean, scientists, in a certain way, and I try to imagine, um, I try to imagine the mind of Richard Dawkins, which is of course very difficult to do, and I will never propose I want to engage in mind reading, but the scientific that's the problem. If you only attack what one paradigm can't explain, then inherently you basically you have to be careful that you don't mix some rebellious spirit into your argumentation, because then in the end you say that we are the ones who are correct, we know the truth, and that's what the evolutionary science argument always seems to me. It's like, oh, it's completely self-evident that it needs to be this and that way, right? And they basically don't even engage with the other side, but they only point out, yeah, they point out where the other side made some mistakes and say we can explain that better, and period. But is it true that they don't, they just make believe that it's true, and they think themselves that it's true, but it doesn't have to be, right?
But,
I remember a discussion with between two people about the George Floyd case, right? So that basically this police officer sat on his neck with his knee, and then the question was, well, was that direct contributor to the death of George Floyd, or was that just something that also happened, but George Floyd really died by heart attack from all the drugs he had in the system? And one person was basically saying like, it's completely self-evident that you lean with your knee on somebody's neck, that the person then automatically dies. And that person who said that could never really discuss, because that was the very premise that we tried to discuss, right? And he just said, no, we don't need to discuss this. This is just self-evidently true. And of course not. That was the point we were discussing. But evolutionary scientists sometimes seem to me the same, right? They just jump on something that is self-explanatory. Of course that's the way. Yeah, that's the truth. But there's no real debate to be had then, because they're basically refusing to engage in some of the arguments.
yeah. Before I go to the next point, you'll like this. Record Deepness says, if you could fully understand the mind of Dawkins, that would be a mental scientific breakthrough.
I think South Park has done a good job so far. Has come closest, yeah. But yeah.
No, South Park was great on that front. But the other thing too, there are some fascinating admissions by both of these guys. Dawkins says there's no proof of evolution. He says, I'm like, wow, Dawkins. I'm actually, that was like the first thing he says. There's no Pythagorean proof. There's no proof for evolution. Now, I know what he means by proof in that sense is mathematical or logical proof, but still. And then, of course, he then grandstands the whole time and provides no evidence. So that's kind of interesting. And then John Maynard Smith says that, yes, appealing to the dispatch box joke, you could argue that this represents common design. And in fact, that's what Wilder Smith said. He says the commonality that we observe is the result of the commonality imposed on these physical structures by a mind. And the fact that, at least conceptually, John Maynard Smith admitted that could be possible was a huge concession. Now, he then says, well, that explains everything, therefore it explains nothing. That's really kind of a bad argument. So let's say, for example, I have, Florian, I have you look at a Hyundai and a Mazda and a Ford, and I'm like, look at they all have, drivetrains and axles and four wheels and doors. They have all these homologous properties. And, everybody who looks at that would be like, yeah, well, the best explanation would be that they were designed that way for automobile convenience of use. And it's like, everybody understands that to be a perfectly reasonable explanation for the homology that we see in these vehicles.
Yeah.
And no, but nobody would say, "Oh, well, that explains everything." Well, it does. It doesn't explain everything, but it does explain those, observable features. And so they're making some interesting concessions without, I think, fully being aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, explain is that's a well, I had another example in my mind for explanation. The husband comes home from work late one day because he's stuck in traffic, and he says to his wife, "I was stuck in traffic," but the wife is convinced he was having an affair, so she will say, "Your entire behavior perfectly well explains that you had an affair." But they can't prove it. But she will still maybe she even has the best explanation of what happened there, but it still doesn't mean it needs to be true, right? So that's the mistake that evolutionary biologists do. They think like, okay, it can be explained, and so I think in a way it came also up a little bit stronger in the 80s because of political paradigms, right? So basically, you had the conservatives, the pro-religious side, the traditional religious side was very strong, and so in a way, people got, especially younger people and also scientists probably got annoyed by that and just said, Occam's razor says it's not just that explanation; it's a much more simple explanation for what we do, right? The youth today, they are this is abomination what they do. They don't please the Lord anymore, and they said, well, a simple explanation. We just want to have a little bit of fun, and there's no harm in that. And so then basically that became just as this Occam's razor thing probably also is part of a rebellion against traditional morality. If you really take it to its extreme. And we shouldn't forget that that also plays a role in there, right? And I think evolution has probably tried to explain too much, and then it needs to be pared down a little bit because people were just instinctively reaching for non-religious explanation when there maybe is no simple scientific explanation, right? So that also plays a role, and I just wish that scientists would acknowledge that a little bit more today, because we also have found that Lamarck wasn't entirely wrong, right? Lamarck said that environment ensures that traits emerge, and for the most for the most time, it's genetic. It's not the environment, but there's genetic imprinting. There's certainly you can have a mouse that goes like a male mouse goes to a labyrinth and is scared in a certain room, right? It gets an electroshock or whatever, and the mouse just avoids those rooms and is scared of those rooms. Now, and interestingly, the offspring of that mouse, although the offspring have never really seen that room, they will now avoid that room too. And if you take a non-scared male mouse, his offspring will not have the same premonition toward that room, right? So there's environmental imprinting, and that actually argues a little bit in favor of Lamarckism. And so even there's findings coming out from science that would refute part of the common scientific consensus. And the only thing that is really unfortunate is that scientists nowadays will just say, yeah, that's science, that's science. We change our opinion if there's something new coming out. Yeah, but before that new thing came out, you used your opinion to make an appeal to authority all the time, right? You never said like, oh, maybe we are wrong. Maybe we're wrong about COVID. Maybe we're wrong about this and that. And then when it comes out that you were in fact wrong, then you say, oh yeah, that can happen. But before you always said, no, we are the truth. And that's the thing that is grating about this whole thing, this whole debate
Well,
also.
I was going to make another point about something that was brought up in the debate. Now I'm trying to remember what it was. Well, I was going to ask you, do you have anything more that you want to add on the observations of this debate?
I think we've covered everything.
Yeah, I think so too. So, yeah, do you just want to have a concluding remark about the whole thing?
Um, I think coming from a purely scientific point of view, I have to say I'm very happy that my mind has been changed a little bit more towards alternative explanations, and I I hope to go further in that endeavor.
Well, all right. Well, I'm glad. Thanks for coming on, Florian. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis, President of Folly Podcast, signing off.